And we are back with Business Matters. I'm your host, Andy Shallal, and you are listening to WPFW 89.3 FM. This year, the ACLU put out a report which stated that American policing has become excessively militarized through the use of weapons and tactics designed for the battlefield, and that this militarization unfairly impacts people of color and undermines individual liberties, and it has been allowed to happen in the absence of any meaningful public discussion. It is harming civil liberties, ramping up the war on drugs, impacting the most marginalized members of society, and transforming neighborhoods into war zones. My guest this segment is Michael Shank. He is the Associate Director of Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation in Washington, D.C. He is also a professor at George Mason University, School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. Michael, welcome to Business Matters.
It's great to be here, Andy. Thank you.
Some people asked me, they said, I thought you have a business show. Why would you be talking about the militarization of police? This is big business, isn't it?
This is big business for defense industry. It's a huge business.
It's a big boom. I was reading somewhere that a lot of the military equipment that the police departments get is basically surplus from the Pentagon.
Right. So they can get it two ways. One is through the 1033 program in the Pentagon, surplus equipment from the war zone, so mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, tanks, Humvees, armored personnel carriers, assault weapons, grenade launchers, armored drones, all coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan, goes free to U.S. Police Department, provided that the police department pays for the transfer of the vehicle and any maintenance after. Or they can get it through the Department of Homeland Security's terrorism grants. The DHS has given $35 billion since 2001 in essentially cash grants. And if you're a police chief, you can use that cash to then buy new equipment, which is where the defense industry comes in and why it's big business.
Right.
To militarize your police department if you want it. So the 1033 program has given roughly $5 billion in free equipment, or the DHS program $35 billion.
Wow. This is mind-boggling, and it's interesting that this all came out really fairly recently. I mean, the conversation had been going on for a while, I know that, but it wasn't until Ferguson, really, that people started really talking about this issue. Isn't that true?
Ferguson is definitely a tipping point. We were working with Congressman Hank Johnson in the House Armed Services Committee earlier this year. As of March, Hank and I wrote a piece for USA Today on this problem. But at the Friends Committee, we were writing on this last fall. But anyone who was on the streets of Seattle, WTO protests, or in the Occupy protests, they saw these armored personnel carriers come out in response. But Ferguson is definitely a tipping point.
Yeah. What started all this militarization of police, aside from the fact that it's obviously big business for the military, and that's obviously the main reason, but is it an extension of the war on drugs?
Extension of the war on drugs. Hank Johnson's bill has scrapped that language because he sees it as very problematic, as do we.
Yeah.
But after 2001, DHS wanted to flood police with cash grants to improve the interoperability of first responders, which is a benign task. You want first responders to be able to talk to each other. You want the radio signals and the radio equipment to be the same. But then they started using that cash in the early 2000s to buy heavier equipment to respond to the very unlikely scenario of a Boston or a New York. So you're seeing very small towns as small as Dundee, Michigan, 3,900 people, getting MRAPs. 25 towns across America, 25,000.
And MRAPs, for those of us that are not familiar with that lingo, what is an MRAP?
Mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle. So
mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles in Dundee,
Michigan. 3,900. Roanoke Rapids, North
Carolina.
You
never know who's putting mines all over the streets.
You never know.
Yep.
Ohio State University got an MRAP. You never know about the students when they're protesting. There might be some IEDs in your way. Yeah. It's pretty egregious. 13,000 MRAPs are waiting to be distributed to U.S. police. Now, there are a few good stories. San Jose Police Department is giving back their MRAP to the Pentagon, so kudos to San Jose Police Department for giving theirs back.
And why? Is it because they have a really good mayor, or what's the deal?
There was enough public furor. City Council responded saying we don't want militarization of our main street, in this case San Jose.
Did that happen recently?
It did happen recently.
After Ferguson was?
Yeah, so your ACLU report is appropriate in terms of the lack of public dissent or discontent over this issue, but since the Senate hearing last week and we have a House hearing this week, you're seeing a lot more public awareness about this and a lot of people pushing back. They don't want the American way of life disrupted by these military grade equipment coming back to their streets.
And since we're a colony here in D.C., we don't really make our own decisions. I'm afraid to ask, what's the status of D.C.? I know that there's lots of websites people can go to and look up exactly what equipment every city has asked for and has. But do you know offhand what where DC stands?
I have seen a few armored personnel carriers parked around City Hall. I tweeted at you a link based on a New York Times FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request.
And we'll share that with people.
Where you can research what D.C. has received. Unfortunately, there's very little monitoring oversight of this program. So the Pentagon, when they testified in the Senate hearing last week, said, we're not doing oversight, we're not monitoring, and a lot of this equipment is actually going on eBay, given away to friends. Police chiefs, county sheriffs are giving these assault weapons either away to friends or selling it on eBay.
Whoa, wait a minute.
That's right. Yeah. I'm not making this up.
You're not making this up.
I'm not making this up.
So they get this equipment once they feel like they don't really need it. They put it on eBay.
Well, even worse, New York State. So the Senate hearing claimed, New York is a great example of where we use this military-grade equipment to, thwart a potential attack in Times Square. But they were actually outsourcing the monitoring oversight of this 1033 program, free surplus from the Pentagon, to an intern. We cited it in one of the articles we wrote for The Guardian and then for Reuters. But the lack of oversight.
The Guardian and Reuters.
Yeah.
Not the Washington Post, the New York Times.
Well, I eventually wrote something with
the articles in the New York Times.
My coworker Elizabeth Beavers in the New York Times. So finally, Washington Post is covering this story. But I would encourage them to do investigative study of what DC MPD has received, because I'm sure it's more than we know.
Did you hear that, Jeff Bezos? You need to get on this.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. Well, simply, we don't want war, period. My organization doesn't want war in Iraq or in Afghanistan, but we certainly don't want American main streets looking like a war zone.
Absolutely.
It just sets up an antagonistic relationship with the community. Community's much more defensive, much more likely to respond with violence if they're seeing these MRAPs patrolling their streets.
I don't think that's just here. I think everywhere in the world.
That's right.
When you have people standing looking like they're from a sci-fi film with big, huge weaponry, the response is going to be a little bit angry and anxious.
There's a whole other problem, too. It's Radley Balco covers it in his work on The Rise of the Warrior Cop, the SWATification of just the issuance of a basic search warrant. So Department of Education has actually used a SWAT team. Radley says we've got 150, on average, 150 SWAT raids a day just to issue a basic warrant. And so the Department of Ed is even using a SWAT team to go in. What would have been a normal knock on the door, hey, here's your warrant. Yeah.
The SWATification.
The SWATification.
Wow. And I had read somewhere that actually those SWATifications have increased by about 80,000 this year.
Doesn't surprise me. I'm not covering that as intensely as I'm covering the 1033
And it used
program.
to be like in the hundreds or a couple hundred at the most.
Yeah.
It went to 80,000.
It's crazy.
It is crazy because isn't part of the Pentagon rap is that you have to use the equipment within a certain amount of time?
That's exactly right. You have to use it within a year.
And what happens if you don't?
Well,
they use it against you.
That's right.
They invade your city.
In theory, they take it back, but unfortunately, there's no needs assessment. And the Pentagon even says in their hearing, in the Senate hearing that McCaskill and Coburn and Paul hosted just last week, the Pentagon said, Defense Logistics Agency, we don't know enough about policing to do oversight of this program. That's their claim. They don't know enough about policing. But there's no oversight. There's no needs assessment. So they're not actually recalling any equipment if it's not needed by the Roanoke Rapids of North Carolina or the Dundees of Michigan.
And what would they do with it? I mean, if it's recalled, they put it back in the graveyard?
Well, someone else did a story on this saying that it would just go to foreign governments through the EDA excess defense equipment program. We're encouraging it to be recycled or dismantled completely, but certainly not given away to police. So we're militarizing America and setting up a nice pretext for defense industry to come in and be like, hey, we need some new equipment for the next war. And then Congress issues contracts. And then we see just the rebuild of new equipment when we've actually had that equipment, because 1/3 of all 1033 Pentagon surplus is new. The other 2/3 is not too old. It's 6 or 7 years old. So this is equipment that if the Pentagon really needed for the next war, again, my organization against that next war, but they could keep it rather than giving it away.
Wow. And think of the resources that are being sucked out of education, of healthcare, of housing, all the important things
these pieces
that people care about.
Yeah. Each MRAP, mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle, $800,000.
One single vehicle is $800,000.
And then for the city to repair it, Harrisonburg, Virginia, You know Harrisonburg. I have some family that lives down there. They got an MRAP. Now, every year, they need $30,000 to $40,000 of taxpayer funds just to do maintenance on it. So here's a piece of equipment that they're never going to need. They're never going to hopefully use, but they have to if it's through the 1033. But now they're spending $40,000 a year when that $40,000 could have gone for something related to economic opportunity, education.
A ton of stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
And I had heard that because they have this excess equipment they have to use, I'd heard that they're using tanks to take cars out of snow, pull cars out of snow during snowstorms.
Well, there we go. Now the public will be in favor of this. This will
exactly.
We'll be towing cars or something. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So incredible.
Yeah, it's a frightening state. You know, you have several police chiefs, Seattle former police chief Norm Stamper and others who are in favor of community-oriented policing. And Norm Stamper used tear gas, rubber bullets, rubber canisters against me and many others in the Seattle protests. He's now come about face.
That's during the
WTO protests,
the World Trade Organization protests,
1999.
Yeah.
He's now come about face, mea culpa, and saying this is not the way to go. The militarization of police is not the way to go. The most effective policing, and we know this, is something that is representative of the community.
Right.
Because 3/4 of police forces across the country in towns 50,000 or more are white majority, and they're often controlling minority communities. So that's why Ferguson was just this really combustible situation, because you had a very segregated community, and the police force did not represent the community, and there was no trust. So you throw in some heavy-grade, military-grade equipment, and it just became the tipping point.
Yeah. And who's doing a lot of work on this? I mean, I think there's a lot of lack of knowledge on this issue, and I think when people become privy to this knowledge, they get very angry because this is close to home. I mean, you know, my background is I'm from Iraq, so people from Iraq have seen this, and they see firsthand the militarization, the intense militarization of their police, and certainly the invasions that they've had to withstand. But here we tend to be insulated to all this and isolated, really, and people don't feel the need to uprise and say this is unacceptable.
This is a little bit of a frog in a boiling pot, and it's a lesson in empathy, too. Your point about young people, adults even growing up in Iraq and Afghanistan with this kind of equipment patrolling their streets and what it does to your psyche. Now Americans...
It makes you numb. It makes you numb to all this. It makes it the new normal.
It's the new normal, and they're guarded, and it undermines social capital, which... increases the proclivity of violence because people are guarded. They're in their house more. They're not out in the streets. If people here listening want to call Eleanor Holmes Norton, or if they're in another state, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, call their reps, encourage them to support Hank Johnson's bill with Congressman Labrador. It's bipartisan. Labrador is a Republican. We're likely going to see a Senate companion bill, but call their reps and their senators and say, we have to do something about this in terms of demilitarizing America's main streets. It's undermining our way of life. So any kind of support we can see in the House and Senate would be greatly appreciated.
So this is gaining bipartisan support in a sense.
Absolutely, and the House Armed Services Committee hearing this week will likely reflect a lot of that bipartisan support too.
That's great. What else can they do here locally? Can we put pressure on our city council, on our mayor to do like, what was it, San Antonio did?
San Jose.
I mean, San Jose did?
Yeah. To return any armored personnel carriers that I saw on the street. I was going to a Shakespeare play, and I passed an armored personnel carrier, took a picture, and tweeted it. Yeah, certainly the mayor should get involved. Again, I would encourage, I think Niraj Chokshi is writing about this for the Washington Post. I would encourage him to do an investigative piece on DC MPD. A lot of this information isn't public, so yeah, a lot of pressure on the mayor and city council to have a full accounting of equipment either through the DHS program, the terrorism grants, or the DOD's, the Pentagon's 1033 program would be great.
But I guess D.C. is a little bit different because we're under sort of the federal government in a sense, in a different way than most cities are.
Right.
We're not a state, and so we can't really make all of our decisions ourselves. But how can people get more involved? I mean, if the mayor and the city council say we don't want this equipment, can they actually not get it, or are they going to be forced to be able to receive it because it has to do with the federal government and protecting citizens and all that?
Great question. My understanding is that in no case is any police department or county sheriff forced to receive either 1033 equipment, because they're actually just filling out a one-page form online and then shopping through the surplus and getting it themselves. Nor are they forced to get DHS stuff. We could take this to Darrell Issa, House Oversight Committee and Government Reform, or Congressman Cummings, and move this forward if there is some federal oversight problems. But we're also working with an organization called stop1033.org and looking at a national campaign to really rally, now that we've got the legislation in place, to really rally the American public against this tide.
Now 1033, how long has that been around?
Since 1997.
1997, okay.
Essentially, Congress authorized this as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, and the line item, the section, was called 1033, which is why it's been called 1033.
I see. And how can people get more involved in this? What can they do to do something about this, other than obviously the phone calls that you said that they should make to the affected individuals, but also how can they maybe get in touch with you and learn more about this stuff so they can be equipped with this information when they go and call?
Sure. I'd encourage them to check out our organization's site, because we have a whole campaign around this, fcnl.org. That stands for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. I can be reached at Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, at fcnl.org. ACLU's report that you mentioned, they're very involved too, so either get involved with ACLU, Friends Committee on National Legislation, supporting Hank Johnson and Congressman Labrador, or calling their senator. Check out stop1033.org as well.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Michael Shank. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I think this is a conversation that's going to hopefully continue, because we tend to have a very short attention span in this country on these issues. But we look forward to speaking more, and maybe we'll have actually some legislation that can prevent this militarization of our police departments.
Thanks for covering this issue, Andy.
Thank you so much, Mike.